I'd like to put to the panel, there's implications clearly from the results in the United States, but domestically, and it's something that everybody's mentioned today, and that is the question about inclusive society and why there is a view in the world now, and we're seeing it, and it's happened in other parts of the globe, and the rise of populist political parties and solutions and so on. From an inclusive point of view, how can we tackle this? One of the suggestions I think Francis made was to people like all of us here in the room go out and speak about why open trade policy is of great benefit, but it's more than that. How is it that we can tackle this question about getting back to the fundamentals of inclusiveness? An Australian economy, as I said, is based on mateship, fair go, etc. Let's start with an economic point of view. Michael, what do you reckon?
I suppose in a sense, if there was an easy answer, we would have done it by now. Doesn't stop an economist talking about it, of course. But I would suggest that the problem here is really the income story. It's very hard to demonstrate the benefits of all these economic reforms and so on when people look at their income and say, well, it's a bit higher than it was last year, but it's not really keeping up with the cost of living. It's not keeping up with the pressures I'm feeling on my family budget. And it comes through very clearly in the surveys that the Commonwealth Bank does about its clients. Everybody views their finances being under pressure at the moment. And how you sort of shift that mindset, I think it's just going to be very, very difficult to do because it's very easy to talk about the benefits of economic reform, but it's even easier to see the costs from an individual perspective. I think everybody feels under pressure that they have to deliver more next year than they did the year before. Is my job going to be there in a year's time, and the like, because of all this sort of rapid pace of change that we're seeing. So I think it's a backdrop where it's going to be very hard to shift that mindset. But probably what we do need to do is get out there and actually sell the benefits in a better and a more effective way than we have up until now. We need to kind of shift the debate more in that direction rather than that focus on the costs, I think.
How does business respond to that, Diane?
No, I think Michael is right. It's the economic argument, and it is about jobs. You showed the elephant curve for the world. If you showed that curve for the United States, I suspect it would look very different. And it would show that there hasn't been much jobs growth for people in the lowest paid jobs. And I think that's a big part of the problem. So we have to look at what is it that households are spending their money on. I'm pretty sure that most people here would have more than $150 a week in their budget to spend on groceries, but that is what the average Australian family of four actually has in their budget. And as energy prices go up, we're going to see that shrink even further. And so that's why a company like Coles, I'm on the Wesfarmers board, so I understand a lot about $1 milk. While there is a lot of angst about the structure of the dairy industry, and it's an export-facing industry, so prices really come from export commodity prices. But if we don't maintain things like $1 milk, it's going to be very hard for that average family of four to fit their budget into that $150 per week. And energy prices are going to be the next big frontier. So, I think it's fantastic that Queensland has a sensible approach to exploitation of your coal seam gas assets. I think it's the moratoria in New South Wales and Victoria are really affecting our ability to have an appropriate supply of gas. It's just crazy that we're going to be the world's biggest gas producer with some of the world's highest energy prices. So these are the things I think that business needs to advocate better for and make a stronger argument.
Francis, you talked about the white paper that your department's doing, and the Productivity Commission is also doing an inquiry on trade policy more generally, which will come out later this year. From the government's public sector perspective and the advice that you give to government, how do we tackle this issue about the apparent inequality and, again, drawing on your comments about we need to get out with voices and speak about the benefits of globalisation. How are we going to approach that from, say, your department's perspective?
Okay, well, there are a couple of questions wrapped up in that, and DFAT by definition tends to work in the international sphere, but increasingly, and this has been one of the byproducts, if you like, of globalisation, what we do externally is intimately connected to what we do internally. I mean, the Productivity Commission for a number of years has been arguing that there's a very strong economic case really for unilateral reform, unilateral economic reform, unilateral trade liberalisation. Now that's not an idea that has really taken root in the real world of policy development, because these trade negotiations, as Jim knows, are typically very hard fought in terms of who makes what concessions in return for what, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership was constructed in such a way that I think everyone thought there was sufficient in the deal for them, even though they were all obliged, Australia as well, to do things that they wouldn't necessarily put on the table in the first instance. So, in the trade negotiation world, it's still very much about what you can get in return for what you give. But I think economists, certainly in theory, and the Productivity Commission, I have no doubt, will say that the real benefits that flow from this could just as easily be created by unilateral economic reform. In terms, though, of the getting the message out, I mean, this is something that my department, that I, as a relatively new secretary, have given quite a bit of thought to. It's not something that we can do on our own. That's why I sort of made a pitch really for you all, for us all, for the business community across Australia, and it's a conversation I've had with the Business Council of Australia as well too, is the voices of economic nationalism, of protectionism, which are understandably there when you look at the pace of restructuring, when you look at the very substantial changes that have taken place in across the world, actually, but particularly in our region and also in our own society. And of course, I think we see also that cities, people who live in cities seem, somehow to be best equipped to deal with this. People in Australia in rural and remote areas face additional challenges. What DFAT is doing, and what I'm going to be doing through a big conference we're doing towards the end of next month, we'll bring back all of our heads of mission from overseas posts. They'll come to Canberra for a couple of days, but then, most importantly, they'll fan out across Australia, not just to the state capitals. Over half of our more than 100 ambassadors will be going out into rural and regional Australia, partly principally actually as a white paper exercise to listen to people's perspectives, but also to talk about the benefits of the work that we do internationally. So although it's a foreign policy white paper, it's intended to cover the full breadth of our international engagement. So those voices will be there. No voice on its own, not even 100 ambassadorial voices will be enough to convince everyone, which is why this work just needs to continue.
Okay. And James, from some lessons perhaps about that inclusiveness question that we are wrestling with here. So too, of course, is the United States, and perhaps, as you alluded to, the election result was something of a surprise to a lot of people, but at the end of the day, when people do analyses of this, there are some clear voices of concern that saw themselves turning up in the polling booths and marking their ballot papers accordingly, or pushing the button on the machine accordingly. What lessons from the United States election result would there be, for example, here in Australia, around this inclusiveness agenda? How do we address that so that next time we go to the ballot box here in Queensland in next year, isn't it, Minister? Next year, and nationally, well, I mean, heartbeat away from election probably at the national level, but what lessons are we learning from that?
They say that the benefits of free trade are broad, but the losses are concentrated. And, in the US, we had something called trade adjustment assistance, which was supposed to benefit and compensate those who could prove that they suffered economically from free trade. And it makes perfect economic sense. You make an investment based on the current economic conditions and laws and regulations. When those change, and to your detriment for the benefit of society as a whole, you should have some sort of compensation. But we did a frankly crap job, and it became a political tool. And so what is reported in the press? What's reported in the press is when the factory moves to Mexico, not when BMW so much moves a factory to South Carolina. It's those who lose their jobs who yell loudest and longest. And you know, Francis talked about automation taking up a lot of it. But if you're a factory worker and you say they're doing the same job I was doing in Mexico, are you saying I can't do that job? It's not because in Mexico because of automation, it's because it's cheaper labor. The anger was so intense that elites like, frankly, myself, a internationalist New Yorker banker, they got angry and they said, you're not listening. You're not listening. You're not listening to our pain. You're not listening to that you're better off with your big salaries and the big towers in New York. But we in the heartland in Columbus, Ohio, have seen our factories go south. We do not know if there's innovation here, how we're going to compete, because we don't have those skills. And we don't know what the future holds. And Diane mentioned the statistic about the percentage of young people who don't think they'll live as well as their parents. Absolutely. So I don't have an answer for how you address it other than making it loud and clear that society benefits, but those who don't get compensated somehow.
Okay. I'm going to throw the microphone open to the floor now. We have a first question over here, please. If you do have a question, the microphone will be brought to you. If you could identify who you are, ask a question. We'll do the debating up here, and that'll be great. Thanks.
Chris Burrell, Chair. One of the things adding to this lack of cohesiveness is the corporate sector's push for a lower tax rate. We seem to have a competition to the bottom. The US has got trillions of dollars worth of debt and people want lower tax rate in the corporate sector. The UK's done the same thing. And it's not popular. And one of the reasons it's not popular is that if companies want to have their people educated here, they want our social security system, they want everything else we've got here, they need to pay their level of proper tax. And so the corporate sector saying they should have lower tax as if there's no cost is quite erroneous, because what we all know is the rest of us are going to end up paying that tax. The same amount of tax has got to be raised. In Australia we'll lose franking. In Australia we'll end up with inheritance taxes, none of which we have. And we've seen a succession over the last week of companies, including Wesfarmers chair, come out yesterday and ask again for lower tax. It's just an erroneous argument. And I understand Australians saying we need to meet the US and the UK, but really what needs to happen is that the corporate sector needs to stop asking, because it is helping in this divide.
The question is, should we be pushing for a 25% tax rate for corporate Australia?
Well, I came out very strongly in my comments on that particular topic, and obviously I'm going to have a different point of view to the one that's just been put. Wesfarmers pays the full corporate tax rate. We do our tax disclosures, so let me underpin that. Make huge contributions through the rest of the economy in the leases, payments that we make to landlords for our stores, the payments that we make in dividends, the salaries and wages of almost 200,000 Australians. So I think we've got to separate the two issues. There is the base erosion and profit shifting concern that global companies move their profits around to lower tax jurisdictions or indeed take advantage of tax laws to avoid paying an appropriate amount. And I am totally opposed to that. I think the work that's being done globally is important, but I think it's been too slow. So I'm very in favour of the unilateral moves that Australia and other economies are making to address this. And it's very much a topic of conversation at the Business Council, where there's quite a lot of peer pressure from companies like Wesfarmers to companies who may not necessarily have the same attitude. That brings me to the second piece, which is, should we have lower corporate tax rates? I think there's a lot of miscommunication about this, which is causing the divide, which you rightly point out. We keep hearing about $50 billion. That would not actually be the impact of a tax cut. Because what would happen in a tax cut is we would be able to grow the economy. Because if companies have more to invest, they will employ more people. You know, they will make investments that they otherwise would not have done. And so, you know, the numbers that I think, and I'm going to check my notes because I don't want to make a mistake, $4 billion, there we go, make a mistake to start off with. If we cut the company tax to 25%, it's about $8 billion a year. But we believe it would grow the size of the economic pie by around $16 billion a year. So there's $4 billion in revenue already coming back in from that. So there may need to be other taxes to fill that gap, but I believe that, you know, potentially that revenue impacts will increase as the size of the economy goes up. So it all comes down to whether you believe that a lower tax rate will engender economic activity, and clearly I do.
Okay. Another question from the floor? Because I've got plenty, but I don't want to monopolise this much. Please, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Peter Olar from the Council of Mayors, SEQ. Question, it's a personal one rather than a corporate one. It seems to me that the focus of returning to business as usual, for want of a better term, is around engaging the disengaged, whether in the workforce or the broader economy. But the truth is that by most reasonable measures, despite what happened 10 years ago, the number of disengaged has decreased very significantly over time. But what has changed, from my point of view, is that there's a significant and growing number in most Western economies who are engaged, who are working full-time or close to full-time, who are increasingly, in real terms or in their perception, struggling. And that's at a time when there's a perception of greater wealth at the top. Now, whether that's true or not, it seems to me that when you get social discohesion, you have it from the centre mass, not from the edges. It was the most educated nation on earth in 1932 that elected Hitler as Chancellor. And it was largely the educated middle class who'd been enfranchised, who'd been engaged, who felt the loss of that, who supported a beast. So if you look at that, I guess to finally cut to my question, if you don't significantly increase the spending power of those who are engaged in the middle classes, and especially in the working class, so that there's a perception they're getting ahead, and a restoration of a belief that their kids can get even further ahead, then the idea of going back to a status quo simply by engaging at the edges would seem to me to be unrealistic. So I'd just be interested in the feelings of a panel on that.
Economic view?
Well, I mean, I think, and again, it comes down to how do we sell the benefits as well as identifying the costs of everything that's been happening. And it's always easy to identify the losers. It's always easy to see where the costs are. It's always easy to build up a very negative case. But we don't kind of have the same approach when it comes to selling the positives. I think they're always discounted. They're always accruing to somebody else. I can't see any benefit myself. And in the end, perception is reality. So I suppose it is how do you change that perception? And part of the task, again, I think just has to come down to how do you market the benefits? How do you prove to people that they are actually benefiting, despite this very real fear in many groups, or there's real feeling in many groups that they are going nowhere. And the corporate tax debate, I think, is a very good example of what is happening here. There's plenty of modelling work out there that shows the economy as a whole will be better off with a lower company tax rate. Now, it's modelling work, and you tell me what answer you've got or you want, and I've got a model that will give you that answer. So there's an element of that in the debate. But we do have a lot of, if you like, independent research going on, and just in the last week or two, the International Monetary Fund has published this work looking at the benefits and costs to Australia of changing the company tax rate, and they come out strongly in favour of that. But I haven't seen anybody really talking much about that side in the tax debate that we're having right now.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Simon Every, Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Just a question on the TPP. Given the United States has now pulled out of that agreement, and probably this is one for Francis, what would be the prospects of perhaps China managing to get itself in and that agreement being reorientated towards being anchored by China rather than the US?
Well, there's a sort of a technical question. The TPP, the 12 parties to this agreement negotiated it, as I said, so that they all benefited from it. They struck a bargain. Multilateral trade negotiations are, by definition, sort of more complex, more challenging, more difficult than even the most challenging bilateral trade negotiation. So the fact that the key party without whose ratification the treaty could not enter into force is stepped to one side raises some obvious questions about where to next, and one of them potentially is wait and try and convince. Another is for the 11 to get together and see what they can come up with, but it couldn't be what's there on the table at the moment because the United States was absolutely central to what was put on the table initially. But it's possible, and it's also possible that a subgroup of the 11 might decide, probably sometime down the track, that they want to preserve the benefits from what was, I think, widely understood to be, agreed to be, a very high quality agreement, probably the highest quality. It was the first one really that brought into play e-commerce and agreements on e-commerce. Look, having been in Beijing throughout the period, or most of the period when the TPP was negotiated, I mean, I think that the Chinese initially saw a strategic dimension to it, an economic element of the rebalance, and they were relatively briefly unhappy about that. And then I think they thought about it a bit more, and the language used by some of the parties to the agreement was in fact welcoming. The reality of it is that once it enters into force, if it does, in whatever form, then other parties, with the agreement of those who've negotiated it, are able to accede to the treaty. They have to take on board all of the disciplines involved in it, and they'd need to negotiate with all of the parties. So it's theoretically possible further down the track, once the thing has entered into force, that other countries could join. I don't think it's a realistic prospect at the moment for China simply to step into where the United States was. It just doesn't work like that in terms of the level of ambition in the agreement. I mean, China's been a member of the World Trade Organization for, almost 16 years, and it's still, frankly, going through processes internally to give effect to the obligations that it took on. So this would be a big, big step up. Where China is deeply involved in negotiations is, as I mentioned, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is genuinely thought to have a sort of lower level of ambition, but that doesn't mean that it's not without value. It certainly does have value. The negotiations are still underway. I think there are those amongst the members of ASEAN who are at the sort of heart of the 16 countries negotiating this, who'd like to get it done this year, their 50th anniversary. We want it to be a high quality agreement. We think it may well take a bit longer than that, but that's where China's focus is. The ultimate aim, though, either through RCEP or through a TPP a bit further down the track, is to get to what's called an FTAP. There are a lot of acronyms in here. A free trade agreement for the Asia Pacific. That could be done through either route. That would be all-encompassing across the region. Mid-2020s and beyond is really the earliest that we'd be looking at for that. But that's a distinct possibility. So, I'm not going to say yes or no to that. What I've done is sort of explained it in a bit more detail, and I hope that helps with the answer.
No? Oh, final question here. Thank you. Just speak.
Thank you. Francis, you mentioned world-class exports of Australia in your talk earlier, and one of the statistics I've heard recently is that when it comes to services exports by Australia, if you exclude tourism and education, it accounts for less than 1% of GDP, which sounds a very miserable number in my view. And And in a world where IT and digital-based services or services underpinned by those are increasing significantly and led by many great American companies, both Apple and Microsoft, or more recently the Airbnbs and Uber and many others, just want your views on how that positions Australia in terms of being able to grow in the way in which the world economy is growing.
Sure, okay, well, the first thing I'd say is don't discount the importance of tourism and education. I mean, they are massively important to us, and of course, they are services that we deliver here, but we're particularly well placed to deliver them, and they make a substantial contribution to our economy. We also have the capability, I mean, we are world-class providers of services in a whole range of areas, and this is something that when Andrew Robb was Minister for Trade and Investment, he would happily reel off at least sort of 30 services in 30 different areas. I won't attempt to emulate that. If you're in the business, you'll know what I mean. A number of our bilateral free trade agreements have provisions for services, and increasingly our negotiators are taking that forward as a significant brief. We've recently upgraded our free trade agreement with Singapore just towards the end of last year, and that's got a substantial services component. So there's always a question, I mean, is it a market, does it need markets to be open? Because as those of you in the service business will know, there are a whole lot of barriers to entry across borders for services. But there's also a trade in services agreement that was pretty well advanced last year, a multilateral agreement. Work still required on all of that. So I would say it's a work in progress, but if you look at the Australian economy and see that 70% of our GDP is generated by services, and you look then at the proportion of services in our exports, it's smaller than it should be, and there's massive potential for growth. That's already happening as a result of free trade agreements with China, Korea, Japan. There's plenty more scope for it. And it will, there are lots of elements to it, including recognition of qualifications and all sorts of other things. So, your main point is right. My point is we're negotiating access, and Australian providers, I think, are very well placed to take up that access as it's achieved.
Look, regrettably, we've come to the end of today for any further questions. I would just, in closing, however, and before inviting Kyle back to the podium, just indicate that, of course, CEDA is at the leading edge of some of this stuff that we've just been talking about. Our research publication that will be coming out in April of this year is looking at the question of outbound investment. In other words, how there is an economic benefit to Australia of Australian companies being engaged in outbound investment. And James talked about a number of those Australian companies that have invested in the United States and the value of that. I might also say that in June, CEDA's major research for the last 12 months will be published, and it's on the services economy. It is about the contribution of services to the Australian economy. So there's two pieces of research that you should look forward to seeing and be here in this room again, both in April and in June, to have people come and speak to you about all that. So look, I'd just quickly like to thank our four panellists. We've gotten through today in, I think, a very appropriate way. We've had no fake news, we've had no alternative facts. We have had genuine dialogue around the issues that are of great importance to all of us. And CEDA has always striven to ensure that that dialogue, whether it be with economics, with a political undertone or whatever, is about good public policy outcomes. And I think today there's been some important issues that have been drawn out for us all. But please join me in thanking our four panellists.